Thank you everybody for joining us for this webinar on gender and biodiversity conservation. My name is Stenka Piskulic and I am the coordinator for REDLAC. REDLAC is a Latin American and Caribbean network of environmental funds. It groups 25 member environmental funds from 17 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And also for all of you to know that we will be hosting a virtual Congress for REDLAC together with the African Network of Environmental Funds. So please stay tuned to our social media for more information about registration to our virtual Congress, which will take place in October of this year. For all of you who are joining us, if you could please use the Q&A section below to tell us your country and organization so that we have a better idea of who is joining us and we can direct your questions and the discussion also according to your needs. So please, if you could share that information with all of us. So I'm very pleased to be hosting this very important webinar and also to have an all-female panel with us today, and also great women leaders in conservation who are joining us for this webinar. As a little bit of an introduction, as you all know, the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda clearly state the empowerment of women has a multiplying effect, and it promotes innovation, economic growth, and social progress. Women are key in accelerating sustainable development worldwide, but we are far from reaching gender equality. Just last year in 2019 in Latin America, only 9 out of 33 environment ministries were led by women. And according to the OECD, women represent only around 23% of STEM graduates, while only 30% are researchers. In the same line, women that work in agriculture do not participate equally when making decisions related to land use, and the loss of biodiversity also impacts women and girls more intensely. So this is really important that we really look at how to reduce this gap and find greater participation for women in conservation and in general in STEM as well. Women need to be involved in the design and implementation of conservation actions to ensure that the root causes are considered. Projects need to be gender inclusive and responsive. In order to make this a reality, all of us, government, civil society, and all the relevant actors should include gender as a cross-cutting issue and must include it in the national biodiversity commitments and strategies. So this is a very good moment, as always, to be discussing the importance of gender conservation as we approach so many important decisions that will be made globally in terms of the Convention on Biological Diversity and other types of agreements, international agreements, in which women need to have a strong and active participation. So I'm very pleased to have this group of leading women join me for this webinar. We will have 8-minute interventions by each one of the speakers, of the panelists, and then we will have 25 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. So please feel free to use the questions and answers section to add your questions so that we can then approach them with the different panelists. I will be introducing each of the speakers as they give their presentation, and I am very honored to introduce Pamela Castillo, who is our Vice Minister of Environment for Costa Rica, as our first speaker. Pamela has a Master in Environmental Security and Peace from the United Nations mandated University for Peace. She has been working for over 18 years in management, conservation, and sustainable use of biodiversity. She was the Executive Director of Centro Científico Tropical, Program Manager at the Forever Costa Rica Association, and Environmental Consultant at the Center for Environmental Law and Natural Resources. Pamela, thank you so much for joining us. It is a great honor to have you here. And I would like to begin this conversation with you, asking you a few questions about the government of Costa Rica's innovative actions to promote and include the gender component in biodiversity conservation. This is something, an agenda that you have been leading within the government. And if you could tell us more about this agenda, and also if there are financial mechanisms for women around protected areas. Please tell us a little bit more about your program. Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you, Zdenka, and thank you everyone who joined us today in this amazing topic, because it's one of the, I think, the biggest challenge one of the biggest challenge on conservation of biodiversity, and is looking conservation by the gender perspective. In this sense, I'm glad to share with you our efforts from the government. It begins probably 10 years ago when we begin with our strategy of RED Plus. In this sense, by this process, we begin to study the gender gaps, understanding what are the different roles between women and men in managing the forest. And then we scale to understand the gender gaps in the other type of conservation activities. In this sense, Costa Rica, as you know, it's 27% territorial, is under protected area category. The other 27% is under coverage by the environmental payment services. That means that our farmers hold the half of the forest of Costa Rica. And what are the role of women in that sense? So we go deeper in this gender analysis and we understand that woman only owns the 8% of the productive land of Costa Rica. In that sense, if we look only for production farms, they hold the 50% of all the farms in Costa Rica. And the size of their land is less than 10 hectares. That means that women in Costa Rica have been left of accessing the environmental incentive in Costa Rica, and they have not been able to access technical assistance for these activities. So the gaps are really, in this moment, it's really a gender gap, really big, if you wanna see. It's a really challenge to close these gaps. And with this study, we map the gender gaps in our country. And we discovered that we have less than 50 women associations that we can build, strengthen their capacities and help them to produce. When I said less than 50 association of women, I mean the ones that are made for this type of activities in conservation activities around protected areas. So when I get to the office on 2018, and I see this gender gap and I say, well, we are studying and now we are doing some systemization of projects that have gender approach. And I say, okay, to how many projects? 27 projects. And why you are doing it? Well, we are doing it because it's a project request. And I say, well, if we want to understand the gender gaps and the gender perspective on conservation, we should look first our institutional approach. So when we were developing the sixth report to the CBD, we do the institutional analysis to understand how we as a state, we were taking this gender gap account in our plans and strategies. And what we found, it was not surprising. We have, for example, 0 women participate in decision making when we come to the regional forest councils in territories. Less than 27% of women participate in decision making for protected areas, understanding the national council or the regional councils. And when we look our employees gaps, well, it was not a surprise either. So for example, SINAC, that is the National System for Protected Areas, it's 1,188 staff. From there, from the whole staff, only 314 are women when we begin the administration. Right now, we are 360 women. So we are beginning to, in 2 years, to get more, to include more women. And when we understand the gaps only in protected areas for this woman who works every day for conservation is amazing. So first of all, they are different in salaries, they are different in the opportunities to scale, and they have not been able to access the leadership positions. They are less than the 27% on leadership positions. So as a government, we took this really serious. So we did a decree to make actions in the strategic actions in the short term, just to close these gaps, understanding that we have a generation change in these institutions right now. So we have to work with us with the civil registry for public servants. That means that we have to ask them to open a woman register, because if we want to close the gap, that means that the terms that when we are employing public servants need to be 2 women and 2 men. And we are less in this registry. So if you look forward, it's really a challenge as a state. We have to change if we want to close the gaps in so detailed actions to make possible that women access leadership positions in conservation issues. And we also, in this decree, create the initiative that is called More Women, More Nature. That is an integrated program, so we can address the gender gap on the institutional level and in the external level with all the different women that contribute every day to conservation activities. So under this program, we are addressing the institutional strengthening. We are, I think that we are one of the first countries that will have this equality seal for the Women Affairs of Costa Rica as a public institutions and the first of the environmental institution in the world to have this seal. That means that we are working with FONAFIFO, that is the Forest Environmental Fund, National Environmental Fund, with SINAC and with CONAHEBI, with all the biodiversity agencies to get this seal and address institutionally the gender perspective on every action and on every policy and on every strategy that we will be developing. And as well, we are working in a quality seal for farmers too. So that means that all these farmer for women that we will talk about a little bit more, with that less of the 8% that I told you at the beginning of the conversation, we will have a special seal. That means that the activity that is under equality seal, that means respect women's rights and give opportunities just to protect their rights and to opportunities to access technical assistance and to access financial mechanisms. So in this sense, this program, More Women, More Nature, the last 22nd of May, launched 3 different financial mechanisms, just to close your questions. And these 3 financial mechanisms consist first in our environmental payment services for women. Why we have this now? Because as I told you, because women access less than the 10%, their size of lands are less than 10% hectares, so they were not able just to access so easily the environmental payment. So it was really easy to manage how to adapt the environmental payment services for women. It was just adding 25 points on the requests for women, so they can scale the line on access to this incentive. As well, we designed 2 microcredits to help these women to develop their activities around the forest. The first one is called FONAFIFO a tu lado, or FONAFIFO just at your side. That is a special microcredit for with special conditions. It's only 4% of interest, and it's money that helps them to develop their activity around the forest. It could be for investment on infrastructure, or it could be on invest on equipment, and it have a special condition of payment. And in this case, they will have the technical assistance of FONAFIP. And the second one, the microcredit that we developed is a public-private microcredit, from Funde Cooperación and IMAS. Funde Cooperación is a private entity, and IMAS is an institutional, a state institution. So how it works is that, as the same as FONAFIFO, it helps women to develop their activities around the forest, and it could be ecotourism, or it could be agriculture, sustainable agriculture. At the end, it has to be a positive impact on the forest conservation. And this, the Funde Cooperación microcredit have a special condition that means that if the person could not access, because it's on a poverty situation, they cannot access to have a guarantee on this credit, IMAS, that is the state institution, will give this aval. So it's a guarantee fund for this special population of women that could not access microcredits because they don't have the ability to have a guarantee on their credit. So it's a mix that they can have this state guarantee for access this special credit. So just to conclude, Costa Rica really wants to push on the CBD at the international level, just to see our condition is not different for the Latin American condition or even African conditions. We want to lead and to insist on having a special target on the post-2020 with the special indicators. It have to be separate. It could not be a principle. It cannot be a topic that is transversal. It has to be a topic with specific goals, so we can actually work on national levels and have more this type of incentives to close the gap. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela. That is amazing work that you are doing. It's Costa Rica has led the way for many years with payments for environmental services, and now to see that women have a special role to play is really cross-cutting and innovative work that is being done by the government of Costa Rica, led by Pamela. And I think we're very proud of how government is leading this effort side by side with civil society to make this happen. I'm sure there will be a lot of questions about how these programs work, and hopefully we can find ways to replicate them in other areas in our region. So thank you very much. We look forward to more discussion when the questions come. Now I'm very proud to introduce Dr. Rene Gonzalez, who is the director of the Mexican Fund for Conservation of Nature. Rene is a biologist from the Occidental College and holds a PhD from Harvard University. She has worked for the Mexican Fund for the last 23 years, in which she has managed different programs, both marine and terrestrial. During this time, the endowment for protected areas in the Fondo Mexicano has grown to $106 million. She became the general director of Fondo Mexicano in 2020, so now starting this new very big challenge of leading the Fondo Mexicano, which is one of the largest conservation trust funds in the world. Rene is also a founding member of the Women in Nature Network. So thank you, Rene, for joining us for this webinar as well. I would like to ask you, Rene, a little bit more about the work that you are doing in terms of the environmental and social safeguards, which are increasingly focusing on indicators based on gender. What are the key elements that need to be considered in biodiversity conservation projects to contemplate and adhere to these safeguards? And I think this is very interesting also with the comment that Pamela just made about the importance of the post-2020 and the special targets. In general, how do we measure success in terms of incorporating gender into these safeguards and into these targets?
Thank you very much, Senka, and it's an honor to be all with you. I see that there's 106 people already connected. I think this topic, I agree with Pamela, is one of the 3 main topics in the world right now in this century. We'll have to address climate change, we'll have to address gender gaps, and definitely food security. So it's exciting to see that countries like Costa Rica are leading the way in this big endeavor. And today I just want to show you what we are doing. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's, this is the way that we're inventing how to address these issues. Gender, fortunately, has become one of the main safeguards in many multilateral. And one of the ones that stand out is the Green Climate Fund. The Green Climate Fund has made it sure that gender is going to be something that they address seriously, and in all, it's going to be cross-cutting in all of the projects, responding to the Sustainable Development Goals. So I thought to show you how to incorporate the gender perspective in a project. So we have been working with gender issues already for 6 years. It's something that we didn't really address from the beginning at Fondo Mexicano. We learned our way through thanks to a lot of people that surrounded us. Women in Nature Network was definitely a very important aspect, with Liana Alonso and other people that worldwide are dealing with this important issue. And then we have a lot of help within the country, within Mexico, of people that are really working on gender issues, not only on environment. And we've learned a lot, and we're still learning. So just let me show you through a few slides how we're incorporating it in order to measure it. So just how do you do it? First, you have to have an assessment that makes sense. And this is what all the financial sources will ask you. What's the legal framework of the country? I mean, Pamela made it very clear that some countries are really advancing. Costa Rica is fantastic that they're not only addressing it from a legal perspective, but also from a programmatic and investment perspective. Then you have to understand the demography and the inequality. In Mexico, there is an index on this. We're doing pretty bad in Mexico. I have to tell you that, as Pamela pointed out, most of the land belongs to men. We have this system that's community land, ejidos, and only 20% of the women have access to land. So, it's a dire situation. We also have more than half of the households in Mexico have domestic violence. So when you're incorporating gender, you have to do it carefully, because you don't know what roles are already established. And by touching those roles, you may actually have side effects that have to be taken into account. And definitely just look into the future and find out what is going to happen with climate change. How is that going to affect women in a different way than men? For example, water is going to be, further and further away, so they'll have to, go and walk and have higher risk and things like that. So I'm going to talk about a project that we have. It's our first project with the Green Climate Fund, so bear with me, we're not experts. But what the Green Climate Fund does is they ask us for an infographic, because they only have 5 minutes to present to the board. So this is the project in one slide. So basically what we want to do is, focus on territories. I think that this landscape approach is very important. And then, do the restoration along rivers and aligning all the investments in the territory to, lead towards a national river restoration strategy. So basically that is the project in a nutshell. And we have actually chosen 2 parts of Mexico: Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico coastal area, and the Ameque Jalisco on the western part of the country. And those areas that are coastal have high mountains close to have a high altitudinal gradients, and the watershed management is very important to actually decrease it.
Sorry.
Sorry, I think that there was a gap. Yeah, I think we're back. Sorry about that.
No problem.
We're dealing with a little hurricane in this area, so it's okay. So if we show the next one, we can, well, you have to really depict and describe how are these impacts differentiated, how do they impact on men and women. And just to give you an idea, with the degradation of soils, well, you lose, of course, production. And so, but women now in Mexico, you have a high migration that has happened over the years, and they are left with these soils that are completely useless. And so they are affected even more than men. And then that increases tension because they not only have to deal with the production that is diminishing, but they also have the workload of taking care of the elderly and taking care of the children. So it is this increased tension and abandoned homes by men is a real challenge for them. And then that loss of fertility then requires that they start doing what in Mexico they do a lot is like in the backyard, they start having a lot of like, supplemental food. And that is even more work for them. So really regaining those ecosystem services is of very important value to women. So how do you do that? And so if we go to the next one. The next slide, please. Okay, then you have to actually develop strategies that make the women go into all these supply chains and that they can actually participate. So first is, what are the activities already conducted by women? Where are they already positioned? For example, they may be in you may not see them and they're not visible. So you have to do, when you're doing your assessment, really understand. For example, in fisheries right now, a study came out that showed, yes, they are there, but they're ones that cut the fish when it has been caught. In cattle ranching, for example, they are not out in the field, but they are really in the production of, for example, cheese, or they may be in some administrative role, or they are doing the backyard production in the solars that I was telling you about. And then they are bringing the children up and they're taking care of the elder. So that's where they are. So how can you generate equal opportunities in terms of access to financial sources, technologies, training? And remember, they are doing many different things. So there is a cognitive overload. You don't want to give them more work. You want to make their work easier for them so that they can explore new things that they can do. And you have to actually develop safe supply chains for them so that they can participate and empower them. So the next slide, please. So right now, a lot of multilaterals, and now this is new for the GF, they are also asking like the Green Climate Fund and Gender Action Plan. So that's when you need to start saying, okay, how many women are we going to work with? There's like a big spectrum and you have a territorial vision in many of our projects. So how many of those are women and how many of them are in vulnerable communities? So what is your universe that you start with? And then how do you make them participate in restoration and, for example, monitoring activities? Activities have to actually be scheduled at a time when children are probably at school so that they can participate. You just have to understand their dynamics. So, but these are like some of the activities that we want, and some of the impact that we want to have. And then we want at the end of the project that their time and their financial inclusion are really taken into account for participation in grants. They will only participate in grants if their work overload is diminished and if it actually is compatible to the activities that they're already doing, at least in our experience. The next slide, please. So what sort of activities are we going to be enacting so that we actually can make sure that they participate? The call for proposals, we're going to publish them in schools, medical centers, places where they go to. And then one thing that some of our colleagues found out is that you need to send them reminders because they're so, they have like so many things to do that right now, WhatsApp in Mexico is being used by all these communities. And if you remind them, next week you have to apply, next week you have to sit down with your friends and put together this proposal and help them with that, then you will increase the probability that they participate. And then take into account things that are already making them not participate in certain things. So for example, we're going to make sure that they know that land tenure is not an issue for us. They don't need to be the landholders. If they get organized and they can put a project together and they can make a proposal, then it's fine with us. They don't need to be the landholders. The next slide, please. And then, then once you start doing the activities, you need to equal pay for jobs performed by men and women. This may sound like, oh, of course, we're going to do that. Well, we were surprised by ourselves when we actually started doing the numbers. And in the proposals that we had approved 3 years ago, we found that in those field jobs that were equal, we were paying women less than men. And this was, planting trees, and it was just the daily wages that had a minimal difference, but there was a difference right there. So it may be like, oh no, but we opened the call for proposals and we made sure that everybody understood that. Well, you need to continue monitoring that through time, because of cultural bias, that will show up somewhere, and that's where you can start making changes. And then, of course, all of our indicators have to disaggregate people by gender during the life of the project. And you have to be willing to actually acknowledge that there's a gender gap and be very specific about where you can make those changes and where you cannot, because it's a difficult situation. It has been going on for centuries. So be very realistic with your indicators, your baseline, and your goal. And then once you are in the territory, re-study the situation. If you are selecting grants like many of the funds in REDLAC are, identify the perceptions. Look at the family structures of those people that are already participating in the grants. What are the rights? What are the needs? What are the roles? Are the responsibilities of women in the localities? They tend not to be very visible. So make them visible. That's the first step. That if we have a recommendation from this last 5 or 6 years working with gender, what we have learned is that it's very important that the women and the men understand what the women are doing. And that visibility is very important, because then recognition comes. And then there is more openness to actually reanalyze gender roles and open up some opportunities. And then market barriers. There may be some issues that make them, for example, security in the field in Mexico is an issue. And so making them walk alone in the fields, that is probably a problem if they're going to participate in the production part of the supply chain. So maybe you want to study where is it easier to actually start making an opening. And then the next slide, please. We have an online system where we actually have changed the whole system so that every time that people report, what they are doing, they tell us how many men, how many women, and that already makes them reflect, in all the grants that we're giving out. Well, yeah, there is like, is there a balance? There's not a balance. Why not? How many are you training? Are they same number of men or women? When you have panels, do you include also women in the panels? When you have workshops, make sure that you are actually, making sure that women or indigenous groups are participating. They come together. And when you have, of course, a situation for indigenous women is even more difficult. So you have to create an enabling environment for that. And then the next slide, please. And then what we decided with the reports is we have very general indicators at the project level, but once you start implementing, then you really develop a feeling of how far you can go. And so it's a very different indicator for gender than it is for other things. Like, for example, with restoration, you can do with $250, you do 1 hectare of coffee, and there's very clear quantitative measures that we have according to national standards. However, when it comes to gender, you really have to understand what's going on. And sometimes that the dynamics that are in place will not allow you to actually have a fixed goal. So what we did, and we really are grateful for all those people that gave us this suggestion, is just let people tell you what's going on. So in the report is, what's going on? Tell us, what is the role of women at the beginning of the project? Has it changed? Has it not changed? What do you think about it? And if it's men that are reporting, it makes them think about it. And it also opens that up, but you're not, you are like really thinking and designing along the way. I think it's a very difficult subject in that respect, because it's not clear cut. It's definitely depends a lot on the dynamics of the people you're working with. And then the next slide, please. Then we have a grievance mechanism, which is what you are going to be requested for any multilateral. And so you want to make sure that people can complain, they can tell you what's going on, they can tell you when there is problems of any type. It can be corruption, it can be fraud, it can be, you know, blocking certain groups to actually have access to proposals, things like that. So you have to have these channels of communication open and make them readily accessible for people in the field, in remote areas. And fortunately today, a lot of the technologies are very useful. It used to be that, you know, we talked to anthropologists and they said that we had to, you know, translate into different Indian languages and go to very remote places. And then later we talked to the groups in those locations and they told us, just send us a WhatsApp or, you know, just put it on Facebook. So sometimes, you know, technology is making things much easier. The next slide, please. And so this is what we're learning. It's a learning experience, and I'm sure through the years we'll have more to report. And, you know, this is my contact information. Make sure that, you know, if you have questions or if you have something to share, you know, we're open to it and we're learning. And I think the main things are be open, understand what's going on. Remember that visibility is the first step. Don't give more work to women. They already have a lot, but make it easier so that they can participate in decision making within comfort in the structure of their own families and, you know, gradually, because otherwise you can have problems. We also had an experience which was very interesting. There's a community led by women that took really, you know, a dominant position during the 60s in their community. They produce coffee. It's female coffee. It's only produced and sent by women to California where they sell. And they actually gave talks to other communities. And then we found out that the role of men was actually threatened. And so now men also are talking about what is their role in this new social structuring that's occurring where equality is starting to emerge. And so that is also an interesting issue, because then you can talk also not about only about gender from the female perspective, but also from the male. All of a sudden they can do things that they couldn't do, like taking care of the children, which is actually a very pleasant and interesting thing for many men. So that's all for now. And thank you so much for talking about such an important topic. It's a great opportunity for us.
Thank you, Renee. That was amazing. I have learned a lot from your presentation. I think that for many of the conservation trust funds and organizations that are starting to discuss these topics in a more formal way, the Fondo Mexicano has a lot to share with all of us, and I believe you can be you can help us all also and empower other organizations to learn from Fondo Mexicano's experience. I really was impressed by the way you have moved from assessment to action, and seeing that action reflected throughout all your indicators and throughout all your process, all the way to a grievance mechanism. I think that it's really important and information that we can definitely share throughout the region. So thank you so much. I also leave with a very clear message in terms of visibility leading to recognition, and also women empowering other women and learning from each other. So I think a lot of topics for our discussion as well. For all of you who are on this webinar, before we move on to our third panelist, I would like to remind you that there's a Q&A section, and we will be starting our Q&A section soon. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please feel free to add them in the Q&A section. Also, if you haven't written your name and the organization you represent, please do so. It's good for us to also see who we are impacting through these webinars. I have seen many names there from other areas in the world, including some who are joining us all the way from India. So it's obviously very important for us to be able to ensure that we can channel some of these discussions also to our public. So please feel free to share that information, and also to ask your questions in the Q&A section. So now we have our final panelist for the day, Paulina Arroyo. I'm very pleased to have you join us today, Paulina. Paulina works in the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, and she is also a member of the Red de Mujeres de Conservación America Latina, so the Women Conservation Network for Latin America. Paulina holds a Master of Environmental Management from Duke University and a Bachelor's in Environmental Studies from the University of Waterloo. She has over 15 years of experience dedicated to conservation and sustainable development issues. She currently leads the Protected Areas and Indigenous Lands Grants Portfolio in Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Peru for the Andes Amazon Initiative of the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Paulina is a member of the Mujeres en Conservación de América Latina Network. Thank you, Paulina, for joining us for this discussion. And I would like to ask you, what do you think are the challenges of women working in conservation? And how do we address them to promote biodiversity conservation, resilience, and gender equality? We've heard, obviously, many examples today, but from your perspective and from what you've seen in your work, what are some of these main challenges that women are facing?
Thank you, Zdenka, and an honor to be in this panel with Vice Minister Pamela Castillo and Dr. René González from the Fondo Mexicano. I have a few slides to share as well, just to be a little bit more didactic of the topic. Can you see? Yes. So just to dive in really quickly, because I know we're short on time, the biodiversity and gender, I just wanted to put this graphic out there because I thought it was so compelling to really put ourselves in the context of where we are right now. And the world is struggling to manage the COVID, and we're going to be struggling soon to manage the economic recession that's behind this. But really what this is illustrating to us is the complete fragmentation that we now are seeing between ourselves, humans, and nature. And so as we struggle to manage these two challenges, we are going to be facing not just the climate change and the climate crisis and all the impacts from that, but also the biodiversity collapse that is going to be coupled with that. So we have enough scientific information that documents this, and this decade will be a critical one for the decisions that we make for the future. The Interpanel on Biodiversity study that came out in 2018 already documented with a great deal of scientific evidence the state of our ecosystems and the state of biodiversity in the world, but I wanted to highlight in the Americas to just give us that regional perspective. We know that in Mesoamerica and the Caribbean, over 66% of the dry forests have been transformed, 88% of the Atlantic forest, over 50% of tropical savannas, and Mediterranean forest, not to mention, dear to my heart, the 17% transformation of the Amazon forest, and couple with that over 25% of our species are threatened. So this is our current reality, and given that we are in this immediate environmental and social crisis, we really need to rethink what we're doing in terms of conservation and how we're doing it and who we're working with. So this is where we're promoting a very explicit connection between gender and environment, and it's very wonderful to have heard Pamela and René making this very explicit. It's no longer a cross-cutting issue, but it really has to be centered to what we do. There is a slew of literature and philosophy and conceptual theory behind gender and environment, and I urge all of you to learn more about it. I won't go into the details, but there's a whole conceptual theory around feminism, ecofeminism, and also indigenous people-centered and indigenous women. And there's some differences amongst those, but there's also a lot of convergence and there's a lot of overlap. And one thing that is common is that the same underlying causes of the environmental destruction that we're seeing today are linked to also oppressive ways that have also oppressed women, indigenous peoples, and other marginalized groups. The extractive models that we have in many countries for the economic models, the patriarchal structures, racism, inequality, these are all very common to what is also affecting us in the environmental world. So given this crisis and all the information that we have on hand, we need all hands on deck to move forward. we also have enough evidence, as Pamela and Renee have pointed out, in all the countries, that there is still a deep inequality amongst men and women in all sectors. So those of us working in the environmental sector, either in private companies or in NGOs or in the public sector, there is still inequality in the payment structures and access to resources, participation levels. And I won't read all the statistics in honor of time, but there are two that I really did want to highlight here. The recent report that was published last week by Global Witness, where in 2019, more environmental defenders have been killed around the world than in 2018. And a good portion of those were in Brazil and Colombia, so coming from our region. And 1 in 10 of those environmental defenders were women. And a recent report from the IUCN that assessed several decades of environmental and national biodiversity plans in 2016 identified only 4% of those biodiversity plans at the national level identified women as agents of change. And I wanted to highlight the agents of change momentum, because I think that's where, to answer your questions, Zdenka, we need to shift. What we're discussing now and what we're looking at as a proposal is, how do we change this paradigm of not being passive actors, but being those agents of change. And this article that just came out also a few days ago in The Guardian really struck me, and I thought it was worth sharing, that women don't necessarily need to predominate or be exactly like men. The whole point is to not replicate or repeat the same patriarchal models, but what we need is for other leaders and men leaders and women leaders to emulate the type of leadership skills that we need for the future. And in the environmental sector, in particular, what REDLAC and its members are known for, protected areas and environmental services, there's improvement. In Peru, 213 women are now working in the National Park Service, and this is increasing. Argentina has a high number of women park rangers since 2016. In Mexico, despite differences, women are holding positions in the Park Service, but still needs to have more work done to get to the director level. And even just looking at the members of REDLAC, you have 50% of the members who are being led by women in the environmental funds across the region. So based on all this information and theory that we have, there's been a movement now spurred since 2015 of women from across the region who have been meeting in workshops in several countries in a very participatory manner. And this all culminated last year in Peru, in the Latin America Congress organized by the IUCN. In the Congress, we got together over 60 women to come up with a joint declaration and a affirmation of what now, what should we be doing now as women and with allied men in the future. And there are 4 main topics that came up out of this, and I invite you to join, and you can also join the declaration. It's still open. Over 1,000 people have signed up till now, and from several countries across the region. But the 4 main topics that we were focusing on is, 1, change the concept of conservation. We really do need to rebuild a new holistic approach to conservation that incorporates empathy, affectivity, and the care for nature, but from a perspective of gender equality. Second, we need to ensure the rights of women, the rights of indigenous peoples, and the rights of other of boys and girls, so that there is not violence, but we ensure that their rights are actually being respected and implemented. Third, we also materialize equity. and that, as Renee said, it's easier said than done. And so when we realize that once you start opening the Pandora's box of equity, many things will be coming out, and we have to be sure that we're able to address them. But as women become agents of change, we need to promote and ensure that they have those spaces of leadership when they're ready to take them on. And fourth, we need to recognize that contribution. As we have seen from the two examples from Costa Rica and Mexico, as women start to become more prominent in those spaces, recognizing their contribution and how they are agents of environmental and social change, we will all benefit from that in the future. So the Women in Conservation is an open network. Here are a few links that I encourage you to go and learn. There's even a wonderful YouTube channel, thanks to one of the members who has in the last 4 months taken advantage of the fact that we're all at home and inspired us to have sessions about biodiversity and conservation and women. And there's also the email there if you are motivated to join us and join the network. So I'll stop there so that we can engage in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paulina. And what a great network, and what a great way to show how women can empower other women by working together and to share lessons across our region. So I encourage all of you to join this network as well. And thank you very much. We have so many questions and very little time. So I think we're going to have a second seminar on this topic, because definitely there seems to be a lot of interest. So I'm going to jump right into a few of the questions and see how many we can answer in the time that we have left. The first question actually comes from Gregory Miller. Hi, Greg, I remember you. So this is the question. 1 in 10 jobs globally is or was in travel and tourism, with 58% by women. Could one of you panelists comment on the intersection between tourism and conservation as it relates to women, and the inequitable access and distribution of wealth in gateway communities around protected areas? How can we ensure that women are not disproportionately impacted by reduction in employment due to COVID, and ensure that women are beneficiaries in a responsible recovery? I think this is a very pertinent question in the times that we are living. I don't know which one of you would like to answer that question. Maybe Pamela, would you like to answer that question?
Well, I can begin. That's a challenge, but I think that for women, it's an opportunity. Women have the opportunity to lead nature-based solutions in this moment that the world needs. And in that sense, the reason is the role they have, that they have done in these regions around the protected areas and the interrelation with tourism. So I think that how to include them and these projects that we discussed, and giving them the opportunity to have access to technical assistance, to financial assistance, and to incentives are just like the main basic conditions that we can work for them to close the gap. Rural women are the ones who are around protected areas, are the ones that have taken care of the forests in their farms, and they have a lot of services to give. So how to include in this moment that the world needs nature-based solutions just to avoid the biodiversity crisis that Paulina just showed. It's giving them the opportunity to be part of the making decision process, make them part of developing strategies, and being part of the formal employment. And that's why the gap that you just asked for. Women in these regions have informal jobs. And why? Because we haven't been able to give the conditions to formal jobs to these women. We, as Paulina and Renee say, if we want to be them part, we have to understand the conditions on how they can participate. When I told you that women participate in Costa Rica, only the 27% of women participate in the different levels of decision making, because women dedicates more than 26 hours per week to taking care of families, kids, elders. So that's why we need to understand when they develop these opportunities to include women to lead nature-based solutions, to give them formal jobs, we have to understand the reality of the roles these women have in the role. So yes, it's an opportunity to women to lead in this moment of recovery of the recovery of economics and with tourism, because but they need the enabled conditions, and that's our responsibility as governments and civil society to work together to give them the opportunity to lead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pamela. We have a question for Renee from Elio Ara. Did you deal with indigenous communities? And if so, how did you approach or deal with cultural issues, such as roles and violence, specifically in indigenous communities?
Yes, we have a long history of working with indigenous groups, and the way we've approached it is always when we have a project, we do the consultation process. Right now with COVID, we recently had one, and Elio, as this communication experts, would really enjoy this. We actually did it through WhatsApp and through videos and through Zoom. It was very interesting, and people participated actively. We can all these things of safeguards we can share with everybody. We're going to actually publish all those safeguards in a month for the specific project I'm talking about, which is in regenerative ranching. And the role of women, you have to actually, what we do is we work with partners. So we work, for example, with universities that have students that speak indigenous languages, and they are all over the different states. And so they help us connect with the different groups where the project is going to take place. And then you have to actually make sure that, you know, when you have this consultation processes, people can participate. And it's interesting because with the pandemic, it is intimidating for some indigenous women to go and participate in workshops, but to actually listen to a video on WhatsApp and send a comment of what they think, it's easier. So we're seeing some you know, things that we did not expect. I think like Pamela, you know, there's going to be opportunities in this crisis. We need to be intelligent enough to see them and seize those opportunities. Although, I mean, I'm not naive in the sense that, you know, a lot of the women are going to be mostly affected by this crisis. There's already some studies in Mexico, and it's going to affect between 10 and 20% more women than men. And so it's premature to say it, but it's likely that. So yeah, when you have the intersection of indigenous groups and women, then I mean, we're also not naive. We know that a lot of indigenous cultures are sexist. There are very few that actually, you know, have more of an equal. And so then it's really tricky to actually not affect, you know, the customs and the culture and the inheritance, but at the same time help women have more of a voice in their communities. It's very tricky, and one thing we do is actually link with experts that actually work and have a long tradition of working for years with this community to understand that our interventions are going to improve and not make things worse, you know. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee. We have many questions. We only have time for 2 more, but we promise to get back to all of you with some of the responses as well. Here is a very interesting comment from Ana Baez, and I would like to direct this question to Paulina. And it says, working to strengthen women is prioritary. However, it's also important not to forget how to teach men about this transformation so that we can join and strengthen each other and not separate. So do we have programs and experiences in this sense? Do you know of any programs and experiences in helping to strengthen men in their participation in this process? Paulina.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And one of the points that I was trying to make in the presentation was that not necessarily by the fact that women are in positions of leadership or are necessarily being empowered is by default the answer. What we need to avoid is to replicate these structures of patriarchy and power, whether you're a man or a woman. And so I remember many years ago when we worked on gender training with a wonderful colleague in Ecuador, Susan Potes, we actually did have dialogues and formulated training also for men, because the point is to work with the men and for everyone to understand where we're coming from. And I think Renee had a wonderful example of the issues that do come up once you start really looking at the context and understanding what people are going through, and the perspectives of both men and women about a common issue are sometimes very different. So it's definitely very important for our men allies to also learn about the process, value, and be cognizant of why this is important. It will depend much on the context that you're working in, with the local communities and especially if there's like a community enterprise involved. I think that can also be very delicate because of the fact that women are accessing more financial resources, and that itself can sometimes bring up issues. And I saw a comment by Bibi Vela in there that it's also, you have to be very cautious that once a project leaves, if you're not very careful, there could be repercussion of violence, increased violence when you are empowering the women. So it's extremely important for men to also be part of the process and to be involved.
Thank you very much, Paulina. We have one more question, and then I'm going to ask each of you for a final remark. And I think this is a very interesting question, and I would like one of you to address it, whichever of you would like to address it. And this is a question that says, I would like to address happiness or lack of it as a women's issue. Does it sound like we are working toward more decision-making, responsibility, and financial opportunity for women? But are we including happiness in this equation? Which of you would like to address that?
Well, it's a great question, but I think that yes, happiness is included when you work with women and you see how you can transform their life, just that giving visibility and recognition of their job and working for them to build on their capacities. You can see the happiness is just in every action that we do. It's not only decision making, is giving them the quality of life, of making decisions that they will not be able if we don't give them the conditions to do it. So yes, happiness, I think that happiness is the center of it, of this action when you work, if you work on gender issues, you are tackling happiness because you are tackling quality of life and improve of this to women. So yes, you can see on their faces that it's happiness all around. That's why I'm so passionate to work in this topic.
Thank you. I don't know if Renee or Paulina would like to say something about that. We can't hear you.
Some foundations that we're working that.
No, now we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Some foundations I'm working with right now, most of the leaders are women, and it's a response to COVID. And one thing that they taught me is about collaborative leadership. And that's very interesting. I think it's not a leadership that's concentrated in one person, but actually it's this formation of networks. And when you have inclusion of women, that happens naturally. And so I think that's very tied to happiness, because if you have all the responsibility in one person, and one person is a patriarchal center, that cannot be, you cannot be very happy about that. But if you work more of as an ecosystem and there's links and connections, I think this pandemic has taught us how important those connections are between human beings. And I think as we move towards collaborative leadership in a more equal world between men and women, I think that we're going to find happiness.
Thank you very much, Renee. To finish this, I would like to ask each of you for a statement in terms of, as I sit here listening to all of you, all good friends who I've known, and I see you are all women leaders in conservation. You are all leading processes forward through NGOs, through government, through foundations, through networks. What has been the biggest challenge that each of you has faced as a woman leading these efforts in conservation, and how have you seen this translated into the passion that you're putting into the work that you're doing? Maybe as a final thought for each of us, if you could express. We can start with Pamela and then Renee and then Paulina, just a final thought on this.
main challenge, I think that the main challenge is the recognition that it is an important topic for biodiversity conservation. And that's the main challenge, to understand that is not a principle, is actually a topic to be addressed in every biodiversity conservation action. I think that just to make it visible as a first step, as Renee said, it gives a lot of challenges and opportunities. For me, I never worked before in gender issues. It was just to realize the first day that I come to the ministry, that gender gap, that women suffer in as an institution level. So it opened my eyes, and then you go deep and you know that is something to be addressed and to work really hard, and you can transform reality to a lot of persons and for society. And I'm so happy to address the question that Anna said, that change can be done. And right now, there is a lot of men in our institution leading this topic. When I ask them, they just like, really, me? And now there are a lot of men getting in capacity building, and they are learning on the topic, and they are leading in their conservation areas, the equality seal. So yes, visibility the first, to make just like conscience of this topic, and it's a really important topic for conservation of biodiversity as a society too. So that will be my answer, and we should all work together in a collaborative leadership to change our society for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Renee?
Yeah, I think the main challenge is that there's so many variables, it's overwhelming. So sometimes you look at it and you see, okay, environment, biodiversity, climate change, then there's gender issues, then there's indigenous groups, then there's also the fiduciary aspects that you have to take care of. And you're like, God, it's just a very complex system. And, and everybody keeps on telling you that, this is the century where decisions you make are going to define the future of humanity, which is right. But then you can sit back and think, well, some other generations in the past had it tough. For example, my grandfather had to live through the Spanish Civil War, and I grew up listening to all these stories. So in the end, I think like Pamela said, there's opportunities in every crisis, and we just have to be intelligent enough. And I think the challenge for us today is how do we link with each other. In 19th century, 20th century, competition was the relationship that was mostly displayed, starting with Darwin in 1859. This is how nature works. But in the last 50 years, we know that collaboration is also a tool of nature, and collaboration also defines the human species. So are we going to be able to collaborate, men, women, indigenous groups, non-indigenous groups, all together, private sector, public sector, social, civil organizations, in a very polarized world? Are we going to build those bridges so that we can come out successfully out of this? I think it's a challenge, and I think we're living this moment, and we have to make use of all of our intelligence to live it fully and never lose your sense of humor. That's important.
Great. Thank you. Paulina?
Yes, thank you, Zdenka. I think the biggest challenge has always been for many years is getting that question, why is this important, and how is gender linked to environmental conservation? And I think given the context we are in now with the environmental crisis, with the social crisis that we have in many of our countries, we need to stop asking the question, what's the links and why is this important? We just need to embrace it and know that this is the right way to do things, and we have to incorporate not just gender equality, but racial equality, and a way of, Renee saying, working collaboratively. And that by default will lead us to the happiness and optimism that somebody asked about. But I think that continues to be the challenge. And now seeing the projects today and the information and evidence that we have today, I don't think we need to keep asking ourselves, is this important and why is it important? I think we just need to do it.
Well, thank you. I have been extremely inspired by the three of you, by the work that you're doing, by the way that you are changing our perception and our way of work and helping to empower women. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to all of you who joined us. We had 112 participants from over 13 countries, including Latin America, Caribbean, India, United States. So it's wonderful to see that there is so much interest. We had so many questions that we will definitely need to have a second webinar to address many of them. We will try to get back to all of you. We have recorded this webinar. We will be posting it on our social media, in our REDLAC social media, so that you can also see it and share it with others as well. Also, we will be having more discussions on this topic during our REDLAC Virtual Congress, which will take place the first week of October. So please stay tuned. We will be giving you more information on the REDLAC Virtual Congress. Many REDLAC members today in this call, so thank you all of you REDLAC members who have joined as well. And also we will be posting more information on the Women in Conservation Network so that you can all join this network as well. So thank you very much to the three of you for joining us. You are an inspiration to all of us. I hope that this is the first of many discussions, and I hope that the work that you're doing can be shared with many other countries and replicated. And thank you for being leaders, just leaders, not only women, but leaders in conservation. Thank you very much to all of you for participating. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Gracias.